I had worked there for years, built a reputation, earned trust. So when they said a serious mistake had my name on it, I truly believed it was just a misunderstanding. I had been with the company long enough that my name carried weight. Not in a flashy way, not the kind of reputation that gets you applause or special treatment, but the quiet kind that builds when people know you do your job well and don't create problems. I was the person managers trusted to handle sensitive projects without supervision, the one coworkers came to when they needed something fixed discreetly. Over the years, performance reviews blurred together into the same language: reliable, thorough, steady under pressure. I never questioned my place there. I didn't feel untouchable, but I felt secure, like I had earned the right to assume good faith from the people around me. So, when I was called into a meeting on a Tuesday afternoon and told there was a serious concern tied to my name, my first instinct wasn't fear, it was confusion. The kind that makes you replay the last few weeks in your head, scanning for something obvious you must have missed. I assumed it was administrative, a documentation issue, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself once everyone was looking at the same facts. I remember sitting across from my manager, hands folded, listening calmly as she explained that a major error had been discovered, one with financial implications, and that internal review pointed back to my role. She spoke carefully, professionally, but there was distance in her voice that hadn't been there before. I asked what the mistake was. She slid a printed report across the table. I scanned it slowly, line by line, waiting for recognition to hit. It didn't. The data didn't match what I remembered submitting. Certain figures were unfamiliar. Approvals appeared under my name that I didn't recall giving. I said as much, calmly. I told her there must be a mix-up, that I could pull my original files and walk through my process step by step. She nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. She said the review team would follow up and that, for now, I should stay available. The meeting ended without accusation, but also without reassurance. The next few days felt strange in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived it. No one openly treated me differently, but something in the air had shifted. Conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. Emails that used to get same-day responses sat unanswered. When I asked a colleague a routine question, they hesitated before replying, like they were choosing each word carefully. I told myself I was being paranoid. Stress does that to you. I focused on gathering what I needed to clear my name: timestamps, drafts, archived messages, confident that once everything was laid out, the situation would correct itself. But the deeper I dug, the less clean things looked. Files I knew I had finalized had later modifications attached to them, edits made after they left my hands. Approval chains were intact, but certain steps felt off. Not wrong enough to scream fraud, just subtle enough to raise questions. I brought this up in a follow-up meeting, pointing out discrepancies without accusing anyone directly. The response was polite, but non-committal. I was told they'd take it into consideration. No one asked who else had access. No one seemed interested in exploring alternatives. The focus remained firmly on me. It was around this time that I started noticing patterns I couldn't ignore. One coworker, in particular, someone senior, someone well-regarded, had gone unusually quiet around me. We'd worked closely on the project in question, coordinating handoffs, reviewing overlapping sections. Now, whenever I tried to loop them into conversations about the review, they deflected. They said legal had advised them not to get involved, that it was out of their hands. It struck me as odd, but I didn't push. I still believed the system would work if I stayed transparent. The discovery happened on a Thursday evening after most people had left. I was still at my desk, organizing files to prepare for another meeting, when an email notification popped up on my screen, one that wasn't addressed to me. It was visible only because the sender had mistakenly replied all to a long internal thread. My name jumped out immediately. The message referenced the same error under investigation, but the tone was different: casual, strategic. Someone was discussing how the issue could be framed to avoid broader scrutiny. Another line mentioned that it was better if it stays contained, followed by my role title in parentheses. I read it twice, then a third time. No one outright said I was being set up, but the implication sat heavy in my chest. This wasn't confusion, this wasn't uncertainty, it was planning. I minimized the window and just sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the office after hours, realizing that the conversation I'd been excluded from had been happening the entire time. The review wasn't about discovering the truth, it was about managing fallout. I didn't confront anyone that night. I forwarded the email to my personal account and shut down my computer, walking out into the empty parking lot with a strange calm I didn't recognize. On the drive home, pieces began to align in ways I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The access levels, the timing of the edits, the way questions were redirected, the silence from people who knew better. It wasn't that no one could see what was happening, it's that they didn't want to. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I understood something that hadn't occurred to me before. This wasn't about whether I could prove my innocence, it was about whether the truth mattered at all. That's when I understood this wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. After that night, I stopped assuming anything would resolve itself on its own. I still showed up to work on time, still answered emails with the same measured tone, still did what I was asked. But internally, something had shifted. The trust I had operated on for years was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level awareness that every interaction mattered now, that every word could be used later. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, not in a dramatic way, but carefully. I saved copies of emails, noted times and dates of conversations, wrote down what was said immediately after meetings while it was still fresh. I didn't know yet what I would need, only that I would regret it if I had nothing. The internal review accelerated after that. Meetings were scheduled with little notice, always framed as routine check-ins, but the questions became sharper. Less about understanding process, more about locking me into specific statements. I noticed how often they asked the same question in slightly different ways, as if trying to see whether my answers would drift. Each time, I stuck to the truth, even when it made me sound uncertain. I refused to fill gaps with speculation. If I didn't know something, I said so. That seemed to frustrate them more than any admission would have. What weighed on me most wasn't the pressure from management, but the quiet complicity around it. People I had worked beside for years avoided eye contact in the hallways. One colleague, someone I had mentored early in their career, stopped responding to my messages altogether. Another pulled me aside once, lowering their voice, telling me to be careful and nothing more. No one offered support openly. No one said I was being treated unfairly. It became clear that whatever narrative was forming about me had already spread, and no one wanted to be associated with the wrong side of it. Eventually, I was shown the formal findings. The language was cautious, but damning. It stated that while there was no evidence of malicious intent, my failure to properly oversee final changes had contributed to the issue. It recommended disciplinary action and hinted that my role might need to be reevaluated. I remember sitting there, reading the document slowly, feeling an odd detachment. They had threaded the needle perfectly. No outright accusation, no clear lie I could point to, just enough ambiguity to make me responsible without ever saying so directly. I asked about the edits made after my submission, the access logs, the approval anomalies. They acknowledged them, then dismissed them as secondary, not central to the conclusion. I realized then that facts alone weren't going to save me. The decision had already been made, and the process was simply there to justify it. The turning point came from an unexpected place. A junior analyst I barely interacted with asked if they could talk to me privately. We met in a quiet conference room, and they looked genuinely nervous, like they were afraid of being seen. They told me they had been pulled into a separate meeting weeks earlier and asked to recreate part of the workflow. When their version didn't match the official timeline, they were told not to worry about it, that leadership would handle the alignment. At the time, they hadn't thought much of it, but after seeing my name attached to everything, it started to bother them. They didn't have proof, nothing concrete enough to overturn the review, but what they gave me was confirmation that I wasn't imagining things, that the inconsistencies I'd noticed weren't just gaps in my memory. Someone higher up had made a decision early on about where the blame needed to land, and everything else had been adjusted around that outcome. I consulted a lawyer soon after, not because I wanted revenge or escalation, but because I needed to understand my options. The advice was sobering. What had happened was unfair, yes, but not illegal in any clean, dramatic way. Companies were allowed to be vague, allowed to prioritize optics, allowed to protect certain people at the expense of others, as long as they followed their own procedures on paper. I could fight it, but it would be slow, expensive, and uncertain, and even if I won, the damage to my reputation inside that organization would be permanent. The final meeting came a week later. They offered me a choice framed as generosity: accept a demotion with a performance plan or leave with a severance package and a neutral reference. I didn't argue. I didn't plead my case again. I had already said everything that could be said. I asked for the details in writing and told them I'd respond within the week. At home that night, I thought about the years I had invested there, the late nights, the loyalty I had assumed was mutual. I thought about how easily all of it had been rewritten when it became inconvenient. In the end, I took the severance, not because I thought it was fair, but because staying would mean accepting a version of events I knew wasn't true and living under it indefinitely. I left quietly. No announcement, no farewell email. A few people reached out privately afterward, saying they were sorry, saying they wished things had gone differently. None of them said they were surprised. It took a long time to stop replaying it all in my head, to stop wondering what I could have done differently. Eventually, I understood that there were forces at play long before my name was ever mentioned. I hadn't lost because I failed. I lost because the outcome had already been chosen, and I was simply the most convenient place to land the blame. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking why it happened and start asking who it was really for. Months passed before anything resembling clarity arrived, and even then, it didn't come as a confession or a dramatic reversal. It came quietly, the way most truths do when they're no longer dangerous to anyone but the person hearing them. I had already started somewhere else by then, a smaller company, lower profile, fewer promises. People there didn't know my history, and I didn't offer it. I learned to keep my head down again, to do my work carefully, to document everything without being obvious about it. The old job became something I rarely talked about, almost like a story that belonged to someone else. Still, it lingered. Certain sounds, an email notification, a meeting invite popping up unexpectedly, triggered the same tightness in my chest. I told myself that was normal, that time would sand it down. I believed that. Or at least I wanted to. The confirmation came on a Tuesday afternoon I almost skipped. A former colleague reached out asking if I wanted coffee, saying they were in the area. We hadn't been close, not enough for casual check-ins, which immediately put me on edge. We met anyway. They talked around it at first, complaining about management, hinting at changes, mentioning names that no longer meant much to me. Then they paused, stared into their cup, and said something offhand, that it was strange how the same person who'd flagged my mistake had recently been reassigned after another issue surfaced. The phrasing stuck with me. Another issue. I asked what they meant. They shrugged, said there had been questions about documentation, about decisions being redirected without approval. Nothing formal, nothing public, just enough to make leadership uncomfortable. I didn't push. I didn't need to. The pieces slid into place on their own, fitting too easily to be coincidence. Later that night, I went back through old files I'd saved without knowing why. Draft emails, calendar invites, notes I'd written to myself after meetings where something felt off, but I couldn't articulate it yet. Read in sequence, they told a story I hadn't been ready to see back then. The timing of approvals, the way responsibilities had shifted subtly in the weeks before everything collapsed. How I'd been positioned closer and closer to a decision I hadn't actually made. It was clean, efficient. If I hadn't trusted the people around me, I might have caught it earlier. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the betrayal itself, but how deliberately my trust had been used as leverage. Nothing happened after that. No apology arrived, no correction was issued. The record remained the same. I understood then that this wasn't about justice or even truth. It was about containment. The organization had absorbed the shock, redirected the damage, and moved on. Admitting what really happened would have required acknowledging a pattern, and patterns make people nervous. I was no longer part of the system, which meant my version of events no longer mattered. That realization should have made me angry. Instead, it left me strangely calm. I stopped waiting for some final moment where it all balanced out. There was no reckoning coming, no satisfying exposure. What I gained instead was something quieter and harder to explain. I learned how fragile reputations really are, how easily they can be transferred like debt. I learned that competence doesn't protect you if it's inconvenient, and loyalty only exists as long as it serves someone else's interests. Most of all, I learned to recognize the early signs, the careful vagueness, the selective memory, the way blame starts to orbit before it lands. I still think about that day sometimes, the moment everything tipped without me realizing it. I used to replay it, searching for the exact second I should have spoken differently or pushed back harder. I don't do that anymore. Now I understand there was never a single moment to fix. The outcome had already been chosen. I was just the last person to know.